Okay, so now it's time for our first keynote session. So our speaker is our advisor, Professor Tien-Chun from Rutgers University, and his talk. The title of his talk is, I think we have a new one, right? The fundamentality of the mental and its religious significance, as shown on the handout. So let's welcome Professor Tien-Chun.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you all so much for having me. I guess I'll sit. I'm not too jet lagged anymore, I think. But if my head just hits the desk, you'll have to nudge me, right? You all have a handout in your booklets, and thank you very much for making these. So at least you have a souvenir you can take home. I'll just go through the handout and try to get you interested in a certain problem in philosophical theology, or you might call it theological anthropology. So I've broadened the topic a bit from the fundamentality of the mental and the afterlife to a more general question about the religious significance. And that's because I started to focus on, I discovered a number of papers, some of them I knew about, others I didn't, that were focused on a very special problem of creationism about the human soul. And so I decided to focus on that. So the question that I want to raise is, suppose you accept a certain combination of philosophical views about mentality, about the nature of consciousness, of felt experience, of what are often called qualia, the qualia of experience, the way that experiences feel. The combination I'm interested in, because I like it, because I think it is plausible, is what I'm going to call property dualism and adverbialism. Now, these aren't my labels. These are labels that have been used by many people, and I'm trying to be consistent with the way people have used them. But these are technical terms, so we have to sort of define them so we're clear about what we're talking about. I want to argue that if you accept property dualism and adverbialism, you get pushed towards a kind of dilemma. The dilemma is you can remain a materialist about human beings, saying we are entirely made out of matter. But it's a weird kind of materialism that you end up with. Or you could become a substance dualist of some kind. The new properties, these conscious feels, they have a new subject as well. So you get a kind of substance dualism. So I think property dualism and adverbialism are attractive in themselves. They push you towards either what I'm going to call ontologically trashy materialism and substance dualism. And then what I want to think about are questions that will naturally arise out of theological traditions if you're faced with this dilemma. And one of the interesting things that I think happens when philosophy of religion addresses problems that come out of contemporary philosophy is you sometimes see views that you hadn't thought of before. There's genuine dialogue. Sometimes you can find ways to resist the argument coming from philosophy. Sometimes you see ways to articulate positions that are more theological. So I'll try to give an example of that. All right, but first let me get you on board here with property dualism and adverbialism. All right. So section 1 here, phenomenal properties and perfectly natural properties. Property dualism is a relatively popular view these days. David Chalmers is someone who everyone knows of his work, and many other people defend a kind of property dualism. And what I want to define is a view that I think he would accept. And it is property dualism is a view it's primarily articulated as a view about phenomenal mental properties. Phenomenal mental properties are ones, this is definition 1 in your handout, they're ones that have a distinctive feel about them. There's a way it feels to have them. So seeing a stop sign, a bullfighter's cape, hallucinating a bloody dagger. In all those cases, there's this reddishness of the experience. Whether there's any red object or not, the experience is reddish. So there's a way that it feels to have that experience. Thinking about Vienna is not like that. I think about Vienna, I picture, I don't know, St. Stephen's. You think about Vienna, you picture that amazing library. I can't remember what it's called. Anyway, you think about Vienna, there's not a distinctive way that it feels for everybody, right? So phenomenal properties are the ones that characterize identifiable ways of feeling, modes of experience. Property dualism is a view about where those properties belong. How fundamental are they? And I'm going to spell out fundamentality in terms of naturalness. How natural are they? So this is a term we get from David Lewis, I believe. P is a natural property, definition 2 here. That just means sharing P is responsible for one of the respects in which things can objectively resemble one another. So being in my pocket is not very natural. You could be a Kleenex, you could be a coin, you could be a piece of lint, you could be a frog. That's not, being in my pocket is not a natural property, but being spherical is a natural property. All the spheres resemble one another in a single way. Now, there's more and there's less natural properties. So, belonging to a certain ethnic group, you know, there's generalizations you can make, but people are very different, right? Having a certain gene that's activated in your body, that's more, there's going to be more precise similarities between people who have that, but again, not a super precise similarity. But presumably there are properties which are intrinsic to things that have them and make them exactly similar in very basic respects. And presumably there is a minimal basis for all the similarities in nature. So D3 defines up this category of the perfectly natural. These are a property is perfectly natural if it's responsible for one of the most fundamental respects in which things can objectively resemble one another. It's in what Lewis called the minimal supervenience basis for all the objective resemblances. So what are these properties? Well, presumably science is trying to find them. Science is trying to find the precise respects in which things resemble one another. So in physics, we are looking for things that will make a pair of particles exactly similar, and so that they will behave precisely similarly. So I'm going to assume, like David Lewis and many others have assumed, that there is such a thing, this family of the perfectly natural properties. So the question one on your handout, are there perfectly natural properties upon which similarities among phenomenological experiences depend? Well, yes, because all similarities supervene upon the distribution of the perfectly natural properties, but that doesn't tell us how natural these properties are. So if functionalists about the mental are correct, then to have a painful experience is to be in some physical state or other that plays a certain role between tissue damage and behavior. That, I could be in pain, you could be in pain, a Martian could be in pain, and the states within us that play this role could be very different. Our behavior could be very different, and so on. But it would still count as pain. So if functionalism is true, we resemble one another in some ways if we're both in pain, but in very extrinsic ways, and being in pain is not a very natural kind of property. Property dualism, as I understand it, is the claim that phenomenal properties, at least, are very natural. They are not merely functional properties. They're not merely representational properties, the brain representing things out in the world in a certain way, where different brains, different kinds of animals could do this in very different ways. The property dualist says, no, the phenomenal is very fundamental, as fundamental as the most basic physical properties that physics would be interested in. So why would you think that? Well, section 2, because it seems intuitively, when you think about it, that the phenomenal does not supervene upon the physical. It's not entirely determined by the physical. So arguments for the conclusion that the phenomenal is independent of the physical are going to support property dualism. But what do I mean here by physical? I'm going to stipulate a meaning, definition 4. P is a fundamental physical property. By that, I mean it's mentioned in final physics. So I'm going to assume, although we may never be able to articulate it, that there is a theory about how the non-mental world works, and that it will have some basic concepts like mass, charge, charm, things like that, shape, locations, spatiotemporal properties. The fundamental physical properties are properties that show up in that theory, and they are not mental themselves. So the reason I add that is because unless you're an epiphenomenalist, you think we make a difference. When I make a choice, when I choose to raise my right hand instead of my left, I'm making a difference in the world. If mentality is fundamental, then physics would actually have to take it into account. Perhaps choices are moving things around in my brain. Perhaps there's a kind of mental force. Well, by fundamental physical property, I mean the fundamental ones that aren't also fundamentally mental. Okay, so if there are basic, perfectly natural mental properties, I don't mean them, even if they would have to show up in a final physics that would explain how everything moves. Okay, so skip definition 5, we don't need that. Now, here I'm just going to gesture at the stories, the intuitions that make people want to be property dualists. And I'm going to assume that there's broad familiarity with these, because if you've read any contemporary philosophy of mind, or even if you've just read Leibniz, you've encountered these kinds of arguments. So Leibniz invites us to imagine that the brain is blown up to the size of a mill, by which he means a big factory. And you see the cogs turning and the pulleys and so on. Where is the feeling? Where is redness? Where is pain? You don't see them there. David Chalmers asked us to imagine zombies, by which he meant not the drooling, brain-eating zombies, but can't you imagine something that has a brain functioning like mine, and yet the lights are not on? There's no experience there. It's an automaton. You can imagine a creature in which the role of the neurons are played by little intelligent beings who are just pushing buttons and carrying out the role of neurons. Would the larger thing be conscious? Would it have pain and pleasure and experience redness and so on? Those are supposed to make us think that we can at least imagine physical duplicates of us without experience, without phenomenal experience. Even better than those cases, I think, are inverted spectrum cases. So red, orange, yellow, blue, indigo, violet is kind of the natural spectrum of light that I see. We can build glasses, goggles, that will switch that for us so that I see things violet, indigo, etc. And we can imagine fiddling with eyes so that you see the spectrum inverted relative to everyone else. We can imagine it further back in the processing that goes on in the brain, because we know the color experience doesn't really happen until some processing goes on past the optic nerves. So why couldn't God, even if you don't believe in God, but just imagine, you know, why couldn't an engineer of human beings create things that are just like human beings, and our brains function similarly to theirs, but their spectrum of color experience is inverted? Well, we wouldn't notice the difference if we talked to them. They would use color words the way we use color words, but their experience would be inverted. If that is right, then their phenomenal experience is not fully determined by the perfectly natural physical properties of their brains and bodies. And that means that their phenomenal experience does not supervene upon the physical. All right. The failure of supervenience is a symptom of a deeper failure. If the phenomenal does not supervene upon the physical, then there's phenomenal properties. Take one, P, let's say tasting saltiness, such that there is no broadly physical property Q in virtue of which a thing has P. I skipped over broadly physical. Things with the same perfectly natural physical properties could differ with respect to a phenomenal property if it does not supervene, if these inversions are possible. So the answer to question 2 then, if these are genuine possibilities, the inversions, the zombies, the answer to do the phenomenal similarities depend entirely upon the fundamental physical properties? The answer is no. They're independent. So property dualism then is a claim about what the most determinate phenomenal properties are like. I should introduce here the notion of determinate and determinable. So being an isosceles triangle is fairly determinate. Being a triangle is less so. Being a plane figure is even less determinate. It's more determinable. So properties come in families, and the phenomenal properties come in families. There's phenomenal experience, there's color experience, there's taste experience, there's saltiness, there's various precise kinds of saltiness. Property dualism, this is on the handout, with respect to the phenomenal is the following claim. There is a family of perfectly natural properties in virtue of which experiences are phenomenally similar or different, and these are determinates falling under the same determinables as the properties that we imagine to be permuted in inverted spectrum cases and to be absent in zombie cases. So property dualism is the view that in my experience, there are perfectly determinate experiential properties that are not fully determined by the purely physical properties. Now, it might be that we can't ourselves in experience pick out the perfectly determinate shades of blue, the perfectly determinate flavors, because our discrimination is not perfect. But if inverted spectrum cases are possible in color, with respect to color, or inversions with respect to sour and sweet and so on, then there are these precise flavors or colors that could be different, even though the physical, the purely physical is exactly the same. So question 3, are these, get the time here, are these perfectly natural properties that ground phenomenal similarities, these are often called qualia, are they determinates of determinables that we are aware of as characterizing our experiences or not? And the answer is yes, they are examples of, instances of experiences, properties in my experience. Here's why I think the inversion and zombie arguments support that view. Premise 1, this is on page, what is this on? 2, okay. Either, first alternative, the perfectly natural properties upon which phenomenal similarities depend are determinates of determinables present in our experiences, or they are fundamental physical properties, or they are perfectly natural properties not present in our experiences. So we're assuming that all similarities depend upon precise similarities in perfectly natural properties. These are the 3 alternatives for phenomenal properties. Now, if we accept the possibility of inversions or the possibility of zombies or Leibniz's mill, then 2 is ruled out, because you can have the same fundamental physical properties but different phenomenal properties. Now, what about this 3rd alternative? Perfectly natural properties that aren't present in our experiences but aren't fundamental physical properties either. A sort of a 3rd thing, neither fish nor fowl. Well, I think the thought experiments should be, we should conclude that they rule this out as well. So we're imagining in these thought experiments that everything about me outside of my phenomenal experience is exactly the same. The physical and any other non-mental properties that might be fundamental, if such things there are, okay? Now, the pushback here is going to come from people like Galen Strawson and other panpsychists or proto-panpsychists who are going to say, well, maybe there are, in addition to the properties that physics describes, there are proto-phenomenal properties of me, or maybe my fundamental physical properties have a phenomenal side to them or something. I'm not aware of these properties, but somehow they're relevant. Well, I think when we're imagining something that's physically just like me, and its spectrum is inverted, we're not imagining anything very precise about the physics. At least we're not if we're like me, where we know very basic things about neurons and and the ways in which neural networks function in the brain. I don't need to know that much about it in order to see that there's a difference between the activations of neurons and phenomenal experience. At least that's what I think. Now, imagine that these neurons had little fields or proto-fields or something like that. Well, how does that help? So I take what's called the combination problem for panpsychism to be a very serious one, just positing some kind of extra properties that are not in my experience, and they belong to my brain or the particles in my brain. I don't see how that helps solve the problem of how mentality arises from brains. So I think that we just run the inverted spectrum thought experiments with whatever these extra properties are supposed to be. So if that's your reason for being a property dualist, you can imagine these inversions. I think you should reject panpsychism, proto-panpsychism, as ways of explaining how conscious experience arises, and that leads to this conclusion: the perfectly natural properties upon which phenomenal similarities depend are present in our experiences. Okay. Now, property dualism, as I've defined it so far, is a view about the properties that give our experiences their feels, their phenomenal feels. But it has not said anything about, and I have not said anything about, what is it that has the qualia? What is it that bears phenomenal redness, or phenomenal saltiness or sweetness, or high-pitched toneness? What is the bearer of the property that makes my experience to have this, this feel to it? A picturesque way of posing the question of the bearer of qualia is to think of the brain as generating these properties and then asking, where does it put them? Now, I think we should think these phenomenal properties are generated by, are caused by activity in our brain. It's only when when I've got sensory input and my brain does some processing that eventually, bing, the lights come on and there's experience. So the brain is generating qualia. If I'm a property dualist, that's what I should think. The qualia are a kind of mental paint. They're mental, this is a term, I think it was Gil Harman, maybe, who came up with this term. It's mental paint because it's the kind of property that's in my experience. If it occurs, there's experiential properties being exemplified somewhere. So the property dualist thinks the brain generates mental paint. Mental paint has to be thrown somewhere. It goes on something. What is that thing? There's various possibilities, but the obvious ones are that the bearer of the mental paint is me, the experiencing subject. Another obvious one is, no, it's not me, it's something that I'm related to in experience. So that thing, having this mental paint, is what makes my experience a reddish experience, or a sweet experience, or a sour experience, and so on. So that second view is what was traditionally called by C.D. Broad and maybe others, the act-object theory of qualia. The qualia that give my experiences their phenomenal characters are properties of something to which I am related. According to the act-object theory, something other than the subject has these perfectly natural forms of phenomenal redness, painfulness, sweetness, and so on. And our experience has its phenomenal type in virtue of these phenomenal properties belonging to this other thing. So what are the candidate objects then, if it's not me? Well, one very natural candidate would be the surfaces of objects. So when I see a red stop sign, that phenomenal redness, that property which I have and which I also have when I hallucinate a bloody dagger, that belongs to the sign. Now, as you can see, this is a kind of projection theory because phenomenal redness doesn't happen except when there's phenomenal experience. So somehow I'm throwing it out there on the sign. Well, this is not a good view. My brain is not doing anything like that. It's not throwing phenomenal redness out at anything. And in the case of hallucinated redness, where does it throw it? I mean, people who held an act-object theory and were property dualists, there used to be lots of them, and they were all sense data theorists. They said, well, there's these special mental particulars. They're generated by the brain. Phenomenal redness goes on those things. When I see a red stop sign or I hallucinate a red dagger, there's a mental thing that has the redness on it. So that led them to the third of these three alternatives here, the idea that there's a mental particular that has the qualia. The middle alternative here is another possibility, that the object that has the phenomenal redness, phenomenal saltiness, or whatever, it's not me, but it is a part of me. It's a part of my brain. And the idealist F.H. Bradley ridiculed this view by calling it the stinking brain theory, because he said if you smell the smell of skunkiness and you're an act-object theorist, and the object that has the stinkiness is a part of your brain, you think that you have a stinky brain. If you're an act-object theorist across the board, you must also think, well, there's phenomenal redness is exemplified by a part of your brain, and sourness, and high-pitched tone, there's a part of your brain that has that, and so on. Now, as I've been describing these act-object theories, I hope you've kind of noticed that the different sense modalities feel different. Some of them invite act-object talk, others do not. So when you experience a reddish afterimage, you kind of want to say, I'm in a relation to a thing that has this phenomenal redness on it, even though I know it's not a physical object. When I talk about tasting sweetness or hearing a sound, it's less obvious that the bearer of the phenomenal property of being loud and high-pitched or being salty is an object at all. It feels more like tasting saltiness is a way of experiencing flavor. Hearing a sound is a way of being stimulated in a soundish sort of way. This has led to the adverbial theory, which is not a great name because it's not like redness is an adverb. But the idea is that experiencing a salty flavor is like dancing in an elegant way, dancing elegantly, or dancing a waltz. To dance a waltz is not to be related to this thing, a waltz. To dance a waltz is to dance in a waltz-ish way, waltzily. It's not really relational, even though it sounds relational. So to taste a sweet flavor is a way of tasting. It's a mode of experiencing. It's not a relation. Pure adverbialists, like my advisor, Roderick Chisholm, he was most of the time a pure adverbialist. He thought experiencing a reddish after image is not relational. It's to be appeared to in a reddish manner, to be appeared to redly. The pure adverbialists think this is the right story about phenomenal properties. And I'm going to assume it. But really, all that matters is that it's the right story for many of our phenomenal properties. Okay. There is a third view, a multiple relation view. I'm not going to talk about that. I think it sort of reduces to the adverbial view. All right. On the adverbial view, the thing that has the fundamental phenomenal properties, the ones that are in my experience, the candidate for those properties is not a physical object, a part of my brain, anything distinct from me. It's me. I experience in a sourish way. I experience redly, and so on. So I'm going to assume then that adverbialism, which is a very plausible view, I think. It used to be most physicalists were adverbialists. They just thought the fundamental phenomenal properties were physical properties of the brain. Adverbialism, I'll assume, is true of at least some sensory modalities. And so the perfectly natural phenomenal properties falling under those determinables must be exemplified by the subject undergoing the experience. Okay, section 5. This combination makes trouble for substance dualism, for substance materialism, for a particular kind of materialism. And I've argued for this in a couple other papers, what I call garden variety materialism. So materialism, generally speaking, is the view that each of us is a thing made entirely of parts that could constitute rocks, stars, or some other utterly unthinking thing. I'm made of stuff that isn't fundamentally thinking. That's what I'm going to mean by materialism. Adverbialism says the mental paint goes on me, the experiencing subject. Materialism says I am an object made of matter. Well, so then which material object am I? What bit of matter gets the mental paint? The answer to this question needs to take into account the fact that on property dualism, there must be basic phenomenal laws. They're basic because there are basic phenomenal properties. So here's the form, the general form basic phenomenal laws take. There are laws of nature with roughly the following form. For every perfectly natural phenomenal property that's lawfully correlated with states of our brains, whenever some things, some Y's, the kinds of atoms, physical fields that fill our heads, are in a certain configuration, C, for example, the way mine are configured now, there is an X which has the phenomenal property in question, an X that stands in some intimate relation R to the Y's. Now, what these laws are like is mysterious, but they have to be there because we know how to make one another have similar pains, experience similar colors, similar tastes. You make this dish in exactly this way, and you can get the person to have that same flavor. So there are laws about the ways that brains generate qualia. Because the qualia are fundamental, there must be fundamental laws about this. What are those laws like? That is completely mysterious. It must have something to do with the way neurons are firing, processing information, perhaps. Chalmers has some theories about the connection between information states and qualia states. But in the old days, like William James, he thought, well, there's on the phenomenal side, there's kind of pure everything experience, and the brain filters experience to get you red and yellow and green and sweet and sour and so on. Who knows? But there have to be fundamental laws. Now, these laws are going to throw the mental paint on something, an X of some kind that stands in some relation to the brain. What is it? If it's made of ordinary matter, what is it? Well, if it's an ordinary object that we already believe in, the ordinary objects we already believe in are things like organisms, brains, hemispheres. We also believe in cells, neurons. We believe in fundamental particles. So are any of these ordinary physical objects or postulated physical objects that we discover by doing biology or by doing physics, are any of those things good candidates? Well, the little ones are not, because they're all very similar. All the neurons in my brain are very similar. All the little particles in my brain are similar. And the large garden variety objects like my left hemisphere, or my whole brain, these are vague objects where the boundaries are like the boundaries of a cloud. When does a particle become part of my brain? It's being drawn across the border of a cell wall, and precisely when is it a part of my brain? These are vague matters, and they don't really matter. These objects have fuzzy boundaries that we could stipulate them, make them more precise by stipulation. In the case of fuzzy objects, like an organism or like a brain, when you look closely, there are ever so many hunks of matter, which are equally good candidates. They're intrinsically well qualified to be identified with the brain or the organism. They differ only in tiny ways with respect to boundary elements. Fundamental laws shouldn't be about that kind of thing. Things that have their boundaries that differ in unimportant ways. They should be about things that have boundaries that are demarcated by perfectly natural properties. This rules out garden variety objects, ordinary vague objects. Now, there could be physically special things that attract the qualia, or there might not be. So the materialist needs to decide, do you think that there's a physically special object in your brain that attracts the qualia, that attracts the mental paint, or don't you? And this leads to two kinds of materialism that are consistent with property dualism. Undiscovered particle materialism, this is on your handout. At one point, Chisholm kind of liked this view. I am a physically special material object. There's a natural physical boundary which doesn't correspond to the rough and ready boundaries that we draw for organisms and organs. The mental paint generated by the brain is attracted to the special object as a matter of basic phenomenal law. That's not a very plausible view because all the neurons are very similar. And also there's no physically special location in the brain. You don't find the pineal gland is like is like this room with a space in the middle where you put something there and that gets the qualia. So the other kind of materialism you could have is ontologically trashy materialism. Johnston talks about trashy objects. On this view, I'm a physically unnatural but psychically special material object. The physical phenomenal laws, the basic phenomenal laws can't find a physically special target for the mental paint, so they throw it at some portion of matter which is otherwise unremarkable. So the phenomenal laws presumably say when part of my brain is doing such and such, boom, red experience happens or sweet experience happens. The law could say the part of the brain that's active there throws it at that part of the brain. But then the object, the material object that's having the experience is not physically special and presumably bounces around in the brain. So then either each subjective experience doesn't persist for long or a material thing can jump around. The undiscovered particle view is bad. Ontological trashy materialism is at least revisionary. So we should think about the third alternative, which is substance dualism. I'm a new object, not made of ordinary matter. The brain throws the mental paint at a new kind of fundamental thing. All right. This kind of substance dualism is massively underdescribed. I haven't said what other properties the substance would have besides qualia, but presumably it would have other properties. So now I've tried to motivate a dilemma from purely philosophical kinds of reasons. The dilemma is property dualism plus adverbialism, a plausible view in the philosophy of mind, leads to either ontologically trashy materialism or substance dualism. This sets up questions for religious reflection, questions that arise for all religions, because all religions have things to say about human beings, have different conceptions of human beings. And all major religious traditions have significantly different theological traditions about what people are like. So there are kinds of Christian materialism, there are kinds of Christian dualism, many kinds. And the same is true within Buddhism for sure, and within Hinduism, I believe. And here I rely on my colleagues, Dao Zhang, Edwin Bryant, and I rely on people here to tell me more about whether ontologically trashy materialism could have any kind of place within your religious tradition, whether substance dualism has a place, or whether there is something wrong with this dilemma. And I know that within Christian theological traditions, you're going to have some people who are materialists, some people who are dualists, and some people who say there's something wrong with your dilemma. Okay, now I know more about Christian traditions, obviously, and I know only what I've learned by co-teaching a little bit with Dao Zhang. We taught a self and suffering in Buddhism and Christianity. We taught a course together. So I learned a little bit. And I could inexpertly speculate about how Buddhists might respond to this, but I'm not going to do that because that would be foolhardy, and you wouldn't learn anything from that. So I want to talk about some responses that I know of from Christian traditions. And the first one I'm just going to briefly describe. There is a kind of dualism that we owe ultimately to Aristotle, but really to St. Thomas's interpretation of Aristotle, a kind of hylomorphic view that sometimes it gets called hylomorphic dualism, sometimes it gets called hylomorphic materialism, but it's a view that in addition to all the material bits that are located where my body is, the bits which look like a cloud of matter, in addition to those things, there is another thing. And St. Thomas calls it a soul. It is supposed to be, among other things, it is supposed to serve as the form of my body. It's supposed to, in some sense, shape the matter, give it certain powers that it wouldn't have otherwise. When I, who don't believe in that kind of soul, zoom in, I just see this cloud of matter. Where the Thomist who believes in this thing zooms in, they see they see the cloud, but they also see this other thing, a thing that informs the matter, and it gives us an object that's special. Now, the hylomorphic dualist will, I assume, say that this compound of form and matter is the thing that attracts the qualia. If they're a property dualist and they're adverbialist, they had better say that the qualia belong to me, because they're modes of my experiencing. Because they believe that I am a combination of form and matter, they should say that this is the thing that has that fundamental property. The brain is doing something which generates this property. The combo of form and matter is a special kind of thing, and it attracts it. So the laws are about the ways that brains throw the mental paint on that thing. I have many questions about hylomorphic dualism. I've asked some of them in other places. But I'm just drawing your attention to it here because it's a view that runs between the horns of this dilemma. It says there's a possibility besides ontological trash on the one hand. You're just a material object that kind of jumps around, and it's just whatever material stuff is lighting up at the moment. And substance dualism, you're not material at all. You don't have material parts. This tries to run between those two horns. I want to know, what is that object objectively vague, or does the soul draw a halo around one very special group of particles? Those are the kinds of questions I want to ask. But I'm just drawing your attention to the fact that here we have a kind of fruitful dialogue between purely philosophical questions about human beings and a theological tradition. And it's perfectly easy, I think, to articulate this possible view that's motivated by a theological tradition in terms that analytic philosophers understand. Now, some analytic philosophers like Peter van Inwagen will be very careful not to understand certain terms there, but they do. They understand them. They just want us to answer more questions about them. Okay, I want to talk about instead, or finally, another view that arises out of a particular theological Christian tradition, creationism about the soul. Now, creationism about the soul will mean something different if you're a Thomist. You're talking about a different kind of thing. That sort of soul is a very different kind of entity. Now, it is like the substance dualist's soul in that it can exist apart from the body, and in principle, it can have feeling and thinking, do some mental stuff, perhaps only by miracle, but it's a different kind of thing. But creationism is a view about whatever the special thing is that we're calling a soul. It's the view that it has to be created specially by God, by miracle. It doesn't happen naturally. Traducianism is the alternative, where it's a natural result of biological processes. I have about 10 minutes?
Yes.
Okay, good.
10 minutes.
Okay. So Catholic teaching, I'm not Catholic myself. I want to say, I'm not Catholic, but I play one on TV. That's an old joke, because there used to be commercials where someone is selling you aspirin or some drug, and they say, I'm not a doctor, but I play one on TV, and I recommend this drug. So I'm not Catholic, so I have some flexibility here. But Catholic teaching rejects traducianism, and I'm very interested in what Catholicism teaches. So I want to know what can be said for and against this idea that God has to specially create souls. And I think the question gets it becomes pressing when we think about animals. And we think about, for instance, the great apes, which have brains that are quite similar to ours in many ways. And we ask, well, do they have souls? Does God have to create them? Now, the official answer is no. Human beings are special. God doesn't have to create a soul, work a miracle for every animal that has conscious experience. So what can be said for and against this view? Can it be made sense of within this dilemma that I've posed? William Hasker is famous for rejecting the idea that miracles are needed for humans or for animals. He wants to say sufficiently complex brains naturally generate consciousness. Okay. Hasker's analogy is a magnet and a field. Magnets naturally generate fields. Fields are distinct from the magnet. Magnets are made out of metal. Fields are not. But the magnet is one thing. The field is another. The field can affect the magnet, but it's a fundamentally new thing. You might also think of a case where you've got a photon and you accelerate it to strike a proton. There's a threshold, which if you cross that threshold, you're going to create another kind of particle, a scion. And that's got new fundamental properties that are not the fundamental properties of a proton or of an electron. It's got a different rest mass, for example. So you cross a certain threshold and you get a new fundamental property, and with it, a new object. The view that Hasker calls emergent dualism is the view that that's how souls arise. You cross a certain threshold of complexity in the brain, you generate a new thing with these new properties, including qualia. If emergent dualism is implausible, but the dilemma is serious, that is, either we're ontologically trashy material things or we're substantial souls, then I think creationism begins to have some plausibility because there are problems with emergence. I have three arguments that I was going to talk about. I think I'll just talk about one of them. These arguments are arguments that if emergent dualism were true, if brains naturally, when they reached a certain level of complexity, generated souls, then brains would naturally generate many, many souls. And that leaves us with a kind of view that's just messy. It's as messy as materialism when you have a cloud of physical objects. And the people who push these arguments are Brandon Rickabow, Igor Gasparov, David Hirshinoff, Mark Johnston, and I think Angus Manouge has done that too, but I couldn't find that reference while I was on the plane. But it's at the end of these are at the end of your handout. Let's look at just the, okay, we'll just look at the first one. Here, the objection is that wherever you've got a brain generating qualia, you have a cloud of physical objects that overlap massively. If one of them generates a soul, they should all be generating souls, in which case there's as many souls as there are material candidates to be my brain. My response to that is, well, there could be a threshold of complexity required for the generation of qualia and their new subject. If you believe in qualia at all, you should think that there's a threshold. These are new fundamental properties, and so there has to be a fact about when you've crossed the threshold. And the trigger point, who knows what it might be. But if you believe in qualia, you have to believe in one. All right. So when that threshold is crossed, qualia are generated. And if you're not a materialist, a soul comes with them. Just because the threshold is crossed many times over by massively overlapping things, that doesn't mean that each of those things should have an equal and independent effect. So think about a magnet and ignore one little particle on one side of the magnet. The remainder of the magnet contributes to the generation of the field. And if that little particle was missing, you'd still have a big field, right? Think about a little particle missing from the other side of the magnet. If that had not been there, the remainder would have generated a big field. Well, put all three of these objects together, the magnet that includes both particles, the magnet that doesn't include the left particle, the magnet that doesn't include the right particle. Those three things overlap massively. Each would generate a big field. We shouldn't think that the three of them together will generate a field that's 3 times as large. Why not? Because the effect comes from 3 objects that overlap massively. So something is similar of the brain and the many brain-like things that are generating the soul. So there's temporal versions, which you have on your handout, of this problem. And in a way, I find them more puzzling. Fortunately, I've just been shown a sign that says I've run out of time. So I will leave the solution of those problems to others. But I hope what I've done is to show that purely philosophical reflection raises interesting questions about the nature of persons, questions that can interact fruitfully with theological traditions, in this case, Christian theological traditions, and familiar theological conceptions of human beings have something to say about these philosophical problems and can benefit from interacting with contemporary analytic philosophy of mind. Thank you.
Okay, we have about 30 minutes to for the Q&A session. Before we open the floor to the participants, I want to introduce some conventions to facilitate the discussions because we have so many people here. So the first one, we will adopt the only hands, no fingers convention, which means you can only
fist then, right? Hand with no fingers is the fist.
So you can raise new questions only. If you have some related questions, then there's no finger like, oh, I want to interrupt. I want to like have a follow-up. No, you just put yourself into the end of the queue. Then you can ask your question until it's your turn. And the second one question is on each time. So if you have multiple questions, then after you ask your first question, then you can tell me that put you to the end of the queue. Okay, so question. David.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So hi. Thank you for the talk. So if I understand like the way you frame things correctly, and maybe I'm not, there is a view that I would take it to be the most intuitive view that you are actually not considering, which is the view that this phenomenal properties suggest, the properties of the object, right? I mean, the brownness of, it's not like something that my brain throws on the desk, and it's also not a property of my brain, it's just the property of the desk.
And it was there all along.
And it was there all along, right? Now also, as you define the terms at the beginning, if I see right, like this view would fall under your definition of property dualism, because I mean you're saying about property dualism is the view that certain mental properties are perfectly natural. Well, that would be perfectly natural, and you define mental as there is a distinctive way it feels to FP. Well, there will be a distinctive way it feels to perceive the brown desk, so they would fall under your definition. And if you if you adopt this view, then I think that you avoid the dichotomy between the substance dualism and the trashy materialism. So yeah, what do you think about that?
Yeah. So I think there's certainly a possible view out there that would be a kind of property dualism. So it says the fundamental physical properties of the entire world do not determine the experienced redness and so on. And experienced redness is, that property can exist unexperienced on the surfaces of things. And there's a possible world where it's inverted. Even though all the physical, the particles are absorbing light in the same way, and so on. I don't know of anybody who holds that view. The people who want to say phenomenal redness is out there on the surfaces of things generally identify it with something that couldn't be it wouldn't be out there if unless things were different physically. So I guess what I think is that if you accept property inversion thought experiments as reasons to think that phenomenal redness is different from anything physical, you should also accept that these inversions, like inversions due to goggles, happen within the person and not out on the surfaces of objects. So if that kind of thought experiment is your reason for being a property dualist, then the properties that have to be fundamental are not on surfaces. They're in you, or you're related to them, but they're not out there. So that's why that sort of kind of what you might call a naive realist view plus property dualism. That's why I've ignored that.
Okay, now I have James and Michael who hold your hand if I don't call your name. James.
Can you hear me? Okay. So thank you. I had a very similar comment, so I'll just add one further thought. This is so I'm a hylomorphist. Big surprise. Okay. But I just wanted to point out that I think the emergent dualist could make the same move, which is to say, in response to the problems that are raised by Rickabaud, Hirschnob, Gasparov. I mean, they could just say there's a unique physical object. Here it is, the brain. When brains come into existence, they generate that. They have it as like an essential property that they generate souls, and they do it when they come into existence, something like that. I mean, that's not exactly option 2 on this, or it's not exactly your response to 1, but I would just say something along those lines, that perhaps they could think that there are not massively overlapping material candidates for the brain, something like that. That's not a very serious point. I was more going to say more along those lines, but that was just a thought on that line.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, here's what you're pointing to is one really big assumption that I'm making when I say the laws couldn't be about these fuzzy things. I'm assuming a kind of supervaluationism about talk about vague objects. I'm assuming that when I say, this organism weighs 160 pounds, what I'm saying is there's a whole bunch of physical objects there, equally good candidates for being the organism, and each of them weighs roughly 160 pounds. And there isn't a further thing which is distinct from all those precise hunks. And that thing weighs 160 pounds. So Peter Van Inwagen is going to reject my story about vagueness and say there are not a whole bunch of physical objects there. There's just one. It's objectively vague where it ends. So there's bits of it that aren't entirely in and aren't entirely out. But it's special. And if you have a special material object, the phenomenal laws had better be about that thing. I mean, and they could easily be about that thing. So this is an important alternative. And I think of that as a kind of, like Van Inwagen is a Christian materialist. But I think of his view as sort of not really arising from a theological tradition. Rather, it's sort of, I've got these guardrails, doctrinal guardrails. I am a materialist for kind of philosophical, scientific reasons. And then I've got to articulate a view that stays within the guardrails. The hylomorphic view says that object, that one special one, it has something very, very metaphysically interesting and special to say about it, where Peter's view is an alternative to that. Yeah.
Okay, Michael.
Hello. Okay. Yeah, thank you so much for a very interesting talk. I love the stuff about trashiness. Question about that, it might be related to what's been said already, but so the question is just, if I have a trashy ontology, why couldn't I use the sort of threshold sort of move that you're making to say that, well, there's a threshold, there's an object in that trash that meets this threshold, and that's where the paint gets thrown on.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely a feasible position. I think if you believe that where, any filled region of space-time, however gerrymandered and unnatural, there's a thing that occupies just that region. If that's your metaphysics, then you can easily say there's something very important about, the regions in my brain that are lit up by qualia over time. That's where the feeling is going on. There's a material object there. It bounces around because different parts of the brain are generating feeling at different times. But it is special because it's psychically special, even if it's not physically special. Now, if you don't believe in, that just any filled region of space-time there's a thing, then you're in trouble, I think, because then you've got a chunk of matter that lights up and a different chunk of matter that lights up, and you'd have to have a material object that can kind of jump around, gaining and losing parts, and move discontinuously. So in that case, I think you would believe that the self is short-lived. There's a bunch of physical objects and they're confused. They think that they are a persisting thing.
Yeah, thanks, Dean, for a wonderful talk. I'm just interested in how you view the highly morphic doctrine, because as you mentioned in this handout, you're saying that, oh, okay, I'll consider this, but it's not the view that I'm going for. I wonder why. Because I think the highly morphic doctrine, that is the Aquinas line, answers this dilemma pretty nicely.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Well, so I have trouble understanding what category this thing belongs to. So it is property-like in that it is, it gives a thing its structure. It's thing-like in that it can exist without informing anything. And in that state, it can think and feel, be like a particular thing. So it's sort of like an extra part, and it's sort of like an abstract thing. By abstract, I mean if you look at a pyramid, say, you can abstract away from the shape and think about the concrete, or the stone that it's made out of. You can abstract away from the mass of the stone and the shape and think about the color. You can abstract away from the mass and the color and just think about the shape. That's a structural feature. A structural feature, like the pyramid shape, could be had by all kinds of different pyramids. And in each case, it's the thing in virtue of which it has the shape that it has. If I thought a soul was a form in that sort of way, I wouldn't be able to see how it could continue to exist without being the shape of something and still be a shape, still. I mean, a pyramid can, poke things. Like if you drop something on a pyramid, it's sharp, sort of, so it can dent something. How the abstract pyramidal shape could dent something, I have no idea. I don't know what to do with that. So I guess my conviction is that Aristotle was in, or Aquinas was in this situation where Aristotle's metaphysics was really powerful and answered loads of questions, and it was appealing. And also Aquinas had to say a bunch of things about persons and what souls were like. And so it was a kind of unhappy halfway house. So that I mean, and I realize that's not an argument. I'm describing my reaction to the view, but I have trouble like Peter Van Inwagen, and I say, well, what I don't understand. How can this thing do all these things? So that's my official reaction. But I do have a lot of respect for the view, and I sort of want to see it get a run for its money. Brian Leftow's version of it in his paper called "Souls Dipped in Dust." That I felt like I was starting to maybe get the swing of it.
Hi, thanks for the wonderful talk. I was thinking about the possibility of the combination of property dualism and constitutionalism. And when you talk about the problem of fuzzy borders,
Yeah.
I feel like, well, actually it is a bit broad because it attacks a lot of physicalist positions, including views such as constitutionalism. And so I wonder what you think about something like a property dualist position plus the claim that we are physical objects we are persons constituted by physical objects, such that the mental properties have the like the property dualistic characteristic you have just mentioned. Yeah, that's my question.
Yeah, very good. That's you're absolutely right that my argument that the basic phenomenal laws don't have a good material object target because there's all these candidates. That argument cuts against constitutionalism. It requires that the hylomorphic view doesn't solve this puzzle about the many. It rejects Van Inwagen's objective vagueness story. So yes, constitutionalism is one response to the problem of the many candidates. And I think, would you accept this sort of description? There are many hunks of matter. There's an individual that's constituted by all of them, or constituted by some number of them, I don't know. But in any case, it's different from all of them. They're mere hunks of matter. It's a living thing, or it's a person, something like that. Right? And I guess my what do I think about constitutionalism? I think things that are intrinsically very similar should, in terms of their size, shape, physical properties, and so on, they should be similar with respect to other properties as well. What is it about the constituted thing that enables it to attract the qualia where the other things don't? I mean, they're about the same size and shape and so on. So why does the constituted thing attract the qualia, but the other things don't? And then I have general, worries about the constituted thing being another instance of mass, shape, charge, and so on, in addition to the matter. And if it merely inherits those properties from the matter, then it kind of seems like a substance dualist view. If it has them in itself, then it seems like it's one thing too many. But no, you're absolutely right. That's the point in the argument where constitutionalism should come in, just like the hylomorphic kind of position would come in and say, you've forgotten about an object there. So.
We have 9 minutes left, so if you can keep your questions within 1 minute and then your reply within 2 minutes.
Okay.
Then we'll see.
Can you hear me? Thank you for the talk. For me, it's a very advanced way of formulating the problem. Apart from philosophy of religion, I also work in philosophy of mind, especially in the Chalmers style way of discussing the issue. So I wonder how your formulation can relate back to the kinds of terminology that I'm familiar with. So I wonder if you would describe your problem as a more advanced way, or maybe a different way of formulating the combination problem, or sometimes the boundary problem, where it concerns how much the combination extends to. And for people who are not familiar with the problem, it's about if electrons also or quarks have another kind of mental property, how do they combine into our qualia? And when you mention basic phenomenal laws, would you think that it would correspond to combinational laws or ways of combinations? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so my way of setting up the problem is meant to sort of be perfectly consistent with kind of the state of play in the discussions of the hard problem of consciousness. And the one view that one possible position that I'm trying to rule out is that the qualia that humans experience are not perfectly natural, fundamental mental properties, because there's some more basic phenomenal or proto-phenomenal properties of matter, properties that physics doesn't know anything about or isn't interested in. And my experience of color is just, that's a very high level kind of thing. It's a matter of having a whole bunch of parts that have this feeling and that feeling and this feeling and that feeling and so on. So my qualia, my qualitative experiences, the properties I'm aware of are not fundamental properties. The basic laws are not about them. The basic phenomenal laws are about these lower level properties. And if those are supposed to be like little feelings that fundamental particles have, then I feel like the combination problem is severe. You know, it's like, okay, what are they supposed to be like? And tell me what they're like. Are they kind of like flavors? Are they kind of like colors? I don't care. They've got some kind of little feels different from my experience, you know? Okay, I can imagine those being exactly the same, but my experience is different. And that's the combination problem. If they're like the pixels on a TV, and my experience is like the TV screen, then there's no problem. The combination problem is solved, and I can see how that could make sense. But there is no screen. There aren't. That's not the way these fundamental proto-phenomenal properties are conceived. So it's important to my setup that the basic properties, the ones that the laws are about, are in my experience, and they're not these more fundamental mental properties that I don't know anything about. Now, I'm not sure how if that addressed. I think what you were asking me to do was sort of locate my dialectic within the current dialectic. Did that do it? Okay.
Thanks so much for that talk. So on the handout in your formulation of the phenomenal laws, or high-level version of them, it says something like, throw the mental paint on the nearest special object, if there is one. So, I mean, that assumes that the substantial souls you're talking about, if this is to actually generate mental paint in them, are located.
Yes.
And I think I understand the motivation. You can correct me, but I assume it has something to do with the laws that you have here. You want them to be sort of general. And I'm just wondering, though, if given that commitment, you're going to be able to avoid more specific laws, and maybe even the kind of laws that the whole view was designed to avoid. Because now I'm wondering what governs the ongoing location of that soul. What determines where it is going forward? And it seems to me like it's going to have to be some sort of law that connects the location of some material object with that soul.
Yeah. So our brains are flying through space because we're on a planet that's spinning around. If my brain generates a little particle, soul particle, that's located in space, it's got a different mass, and if it were a real particle, it would have mass and charge and interact with other things. And as my brain goes flying, it should just kind of go spin off from me. So if the brain generates souls, if souls are in space, if they hang around, they hang around the brain that generates them, then it's like they have some kind of inertial feature to them, and then doesn't that just make them into a particle? Is that kind of the puzzle you're posing?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that would be one horn of the dilemma. The other horn would be that there's some law that connects the location of the brain or whatever the physical object is with the location of that thing. So, I mean, it wouldn't have its own, it wouldn't obey standard physical laws, but it would have this other phenomenal law that connects it with the location of the brain. And then it seems like you're running into, you're going to have to accept the kinds of laws you wanted to avoid.
Oh, which kind of laws do I want to avoid?
Well, one would be a law that speaks of objects that are highly vague.
Oh,
And another would be laws that mention specific things, because that's why I thought the motivation.
yes. Yeah, so I am assuming that there are general laws, and I figured souls are in space because we need to connect my brain with my soul, your brain with your soul, and so on. And this is the natural way to do it. I mean, I think so much is speculative here about what the laws are that take you from brain function to qualia. But if it's something like information processing, you've got this super complex thing. And if it processes this kind of information, you get red square distance experience. If it processes this kind of information, you get taste. There could be a law about this network and the location of the thing. That it's like Leibniz talked about circumscriptive ubiety, and where that's like falling within a region but not being precisely anywhere in there. This many distinct objects here are good candidates for the thing that's processing the information. Each of them is sufficient to generate the soul. All of them are holding the soul in place, perhaps, something like that.
Okay, sorry, I think we are running out of time. So we still have two people who haven't had the chance to ask questions. So maybe we can continue a conversation with Professor ZIMMERMAN during the coffee break, which will last until 11:45. So we come back here at 11:45.